This week, Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer each did their best to seize the political agenda with big speeches. Mr. Sunak wants us to talk about safety in a dangerous world. Sir Keir says we need stability after years of chaos. They both reckon if they can get us talking about their issues, they'll have the edge on election day. In politics, they call it controlling the narrative. In truth, we're probably a long way off a general election, so there's probably a lot more of this kind of stuff to come. The smart money is on an election in October or November. Most experts say Labour, 20 points ahead in the polls, is pretty much nailed on to win. But who knows what could happen between now and then. As Theresa May pointed out this week, in 2017, she called a general election 20 points ahead of Labour, yet after a catastrophic campaign, ended up less than 4 points up, having to depend on the Ulster Unionists to remain in power. We'll no doubt return to the raw politics later in the show, but this week it would seem almost indecent not to start our programme with what is probably the worst medical disaster since the thalidomide outrage of the 1960s, the infected blood scandal. I'm joined by our reporter Ashish Joshi, who's been talking to some of its victims. Ashish, I wonder if we could start by you just giving us the background to this scandal. How did we get here?
This scandal began in the 1970s, was carried on through the 1980s and into the 1990s. It's 50 years in the making. Essentially, what's happened is there were a cohort of haemophiliacs who needed treatments, and there was supposed to be this revolutionary treatment called Factor VIII, a blood product, to help haemophiliacs with blood clotting. But what really happened is that Big Pharma in America were farming this blood product from very dubious sources, prisoners, sex workers, drug addicts, and this blood product was not screened or treated before it was being injected into the veins of some very, very vulnerable people. So this scandal began in the 70s and 80s, and thousands of people, some 30,000 people were infected with these blood products. 3,000 people have died since, and families have lived with this loss for so many years. That's the background, that's the medical background. The risks were known at the time, and yet we found out through journalists, through campaigners, people investigating this scandal, that the risks were known, Trevor. The clinicians who were carrying out these secret trials without their patients knowing, without the families knowing, they carried on with these trials. Even though the risks had been highlighted, the risks had been flagged, they carried on with these investigations because they wanted to make sure that their product was good, it would work, and it came at the expense of haemophiliacs being infected with HIV and hepatitis C. So this has been going on since the 1970s, and successive governments have failed, ignored, rejected demands by these people, these families who have been affected, to address this, and it's been perpetuated by governments, civil servants, clinicians, and it's been a conspiracy of lies. These people have not been listened to, no justice, no compensation, and no formal apology. That will all change tomorrow around midday when Sir Brian Langstaff delivers this report that so many people have died waiting for.
What can we expect from Sir Brian?
Well, we know that Sir Brian has already laid out the framework for compensation, so we expect there will be the compensation question. But what many campaigners, what many families are really wanting is some sort of criminal investigation. They want people held accountable. Whether that will happen tomorrow, it's very difficult to say, but certainly the sense I get that Sir Brian Langstaff has delayed this report twice because he's been having to give people the opportunity to address the claims that have been made against them, the fact that they are being held accountable in his report. He's had to give them time to address those claims. So possibly tomorrow we will see individuals being named, we will see departments, and certainly we will expect Sir Brian Langstaff to point the fingers at some people.
Ashish, thank you. We'll be talking to one of the journalists on our panel, Caroline Wheeler, who has pursued this later on. And I just want to say, by the way, your report on our website and on bulletins has been extremely moving. Thank you. Well, I started our interview with the Defence Secretary this morning with that contaminated blood inquiry when I spoke to Grant Shapps a little earlier. Grant Shapps, tomorrow the government will receive Sir Brian Langstaff's report on the infected blood scandal. I know you can't anticipate what it says, but would you agree that this is one of the most shameful failures of government in our lifetime?
Yes, and it's gone on over a very, very long period of time, decades. I had actually constituents come and see me who lost their son in the infected blood scandal, and they were showing me the photographs of, this obviously happened a long time ago, but they were showing me the photographs of him and how he deteriorated. And, you know, as a parent, anyone would, you know, hearing these stories would absolutely agree with the premise of your question.
You make the point that it was a long time ago you saw those photographs. It's embarrassing that, I mean, and it's tragic, actually, that these people haven't had compensation. I mean, what went wrong with the machinery? I mean, how is it that so many people are now saying, I missed it?
Well, talking to the parents, I haven't obviously seen the report yet, and I think actually, by the way, when that comes out tomorrow, that's very important that that's a day for those who've been affected, like the constituents of mine, rather than for government, but we will come back and respond quickly to it. But listening to those parents who lost their son, I mean, it just makes you angry inside to hear about all the different, you know, essentially lack of anybody taking responsibility, mismanagement.
Everybody had a reason why nothing could happen.
Exactly.
Including, by the way, the politicians.
Well, I mean, I think everyone was, you know, I think everyone was, almost certainly everyone was, again, I haven't seen the report, but I think we know enough about it to know that. And it just made me angry to know that they had lost their son without anyone ever taking responsibility, without it, and so on. So I think this is why it's very important, this report, and tomorrow, because it will give that family and many others the opportunity, and also the opportunity for government to properly respond, which we'll do
the thing,
quickly.
I don't want to turn this into a party political thing, but the thing that they would say they're most angry about is that it's taken so long to get the compensation scheme up and running, and that has taken place under your watch, or your administration's watch.
Well, it's gone on so long. It's actually taken place under every shade of government, in fact.
No, but
it's not been a quick
the decision about the compensation scheme, I think, is only 4 or 5 years ago, and it's just taken. I think what I'm really trying to say is, would you agree it's just taken too long, even in recent times when everybody knew what had gone on? Theresa May set up the inquiry in 2017. Everybody knew it had gone on, and it's still.
Yes, and look, again, as I'm not a real expert on this, in fact, when I checked, they're the only 2 constituents of mine, or one family, who've been affected. So I think that's the other thing, that it's affected a lot of people, but over a very broad, geographical spread in the country. So perhaps there's just never been that critical mass, I don't know. But yes, I think this has been too slow. Of course I do. I mean, you can't speak to that family and many others that will be around the country and not simply think that this is a massive injustice which needs to be put right. And I know the government said we will. The report tomorrow, I think, will be the day for that family and others. And then I know the government will want to respond quickly.
Will the Prime Minister, I think the Prime Minister is going to speak about this tomorrow?
I don't know the exact detail, but I'm quite sure there'll be a full.
Will he be ready to apologise?
Again, let's wait for the Prime Minister to that. I don't want to sort of mislead, because I don't have particular insight into that.
All right, let's talk about your brief. President Zelensky said this week that, and I'm quoting him here, "We are in a nonsense situation where the West is afraid that Russia will lose the war, and it does not want Ukraine to lose it." Is he right that we are, in effect, creating a stalemate in which tens of thousands of people are dying needlessly?
I went to Ukraine, stood in Kyiv and St. Michael's Square earlier in the year, and I made a very similar point, that it was a wake-up moment for the West, and that by delaying what we should be doing, and in fact now have through, in particular, what Congress has done, we were running the risk of doing exactly what President Zelensky is concerned about. And I think this is completely nonsensical for the West. We have to understand we are in an existential battle about the way that we run the world order, about democracy itself. And it's one thing that it's bad enough that people in autocratic states have to put up with having no say at all about the way their country is run and the way citizens have to live their lives. But it's quite another when they try and impose it on free and democratic countries. And as free countries, we have to stand up to that.
When you say the West, when you say free countries, I know that you've announced this morning that we're sending more arms, we're sending more money, more ammunition and so on. Who are the laggards? Who's not pulling their weight?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, first of all, thank you to the British people, because as Defence Secretary, I get nothing but support, not just from other politicians, but from the British people for supporting Ukraine. It is a fact that the delay in sending additional aid, and here obviously the United States Congress was slow on this, had left a hiatus in which, for example, Putin has moved into, or tried to move towards, Kharkiv, which is Ukraine's second biggest city. Now, I'm actually confident that Ukraine will be able to ultimately repel that, although there's a few difficult weeks ahead, because that aid is coming. But nonetheless, that didn't need to happen.
So you would blame partly the United States, and Congress in particular. What about Europeans?
But I think the internal politics there, rather than the administration specifically, for reasons that we all know about, starts to make it complicated.
What about the Europeans?
But yes, I think Europe has to step up as well. And you know, I make this as a wider point. You know, we are living, as I said in my Lancaster House speech in January, we're living in a more dangerous world than we were 10, 15 years ago. And it's really important, therefore, that we lift our ability to defend ourselves. That's why this government's committed to 2.5%. And I want to see other European, as you say, I want to see other European countries do the same.
For example,
anyone
I know some of your colleagues have been talking about the Germans being a bit...
Well, I have to say, in regard to Ukraine, they've actually, not in the first year, but subsequently, put in very large amounts of money, and I think that's been commendable. But I would actually say, you know, we set a NATO minimum of 2% 10 years ago to be met this year. We've now raised that to 2.5%, but meantime, only 2/3 of NATO countries have got to the 2%. So, and what about those countries who enjoy the umbrella of European security but aren't even part of NATO, so aren't even contributing? I mean, I think they have to think about this as well.
I don't want to put you off here, but you're sounding slightly Trumpish here.
Well, I think everyone should play their part, and pay their part. That is certainly true, because in the end, if you are in a country that does not spend on your own defence, but you enjoy the overall umbrella of a security apparatus of essentially, you know, Britain providing our nuclear deterrent to NATO, which we do, then you enjoy the benefits, but you're not paying in. And in this more dangerous world, I think everybody does need to pay in.
OK. Well, there's one other point about this, which the Ukrainians make. No matter how many missiles you send, how much ammunition you dispatch, if you limit their use, they can be next to useless. Why not allow Ukrainians to fire on targets inside Russia?
Well, look, I can't get into things like sensitivities of targeting decisions, other than to say...
Well, no, this is a policy, and you're pretty clear about it. You're open about it. You say these weapons can't be used for certain kinds of offensive action.
Well, in fact...
You've got to change that policy. At some point, you're going to have to go big or go home, aren't you?
In fact, the United Kingdom has been very forward-leaning about the way that our weapons are used, including, and other countries didn't initially do this, but then followed our lead in Crimea, which we see as an integral part of Ukraine. The fact it was invaded by Putin in 2014 doesn't change that, and we were very open about, therefore, providing those permissions. Now, I can't go into, I know you're going to sort of goad me on this, I cannot go into decisions about how weapons are permissioned, but I can say this. Ukraine is in a fight for its survival. The United Kingdom has led the way. We are very helpful, therefore, to our Ukrainian friends, and we encourage others to do the same. But before getting into the bit of the conversation that you're getting into, which I think is, shouldn't they be firing on Russia?
Okay.
What I'd like to see is all of our partners, including Germany, who do have the facility to provide those longer-range weapons, but don't allow them to be used in Crimea, which is part of Ukraine. I think those are the things which would need to happen first.
So a change in policy would be let's just say, it would be an active discussion.
Well, look, it's just not something I can go into on a television programme on air. There are areas of defence which are so sensitive, I'm afraid, they're just not for television discussions.
All right, let's talk about something that I hope is up for discussion. We saw Mr. Putin in Beijing this week, and I was very struck by the body language. We can see some of it here. This is... These two men are not just in a marriage of convenience. There's a bromance going on here. How concerned are you about this growing strength of friendship?
I'm extremely concerned about this because, remember, these are two countries that do not believe in democracy, and Putin literally murders his opponents. That's his MO. That's how he operates. China doesn't share our values of freedom and democracy. I mean, their entire purpose is to keep the Communist Party in place. So if you have that situation and they're trying to spread their system to the rest of the world, we must see and have our eyes wide open that that is a direct threat to our way of life. And if we cherish our freedom and cherish our democracy, then we have to be concerned that they're linking together, and not just that, Russia with Iran and using Iranian Shihad drones, and the link to North Korea, buying North Korean weapons. So you've got this, you've got these number of different countries making the world, trying to make the world, or reshape the world in their image, and that is not good for those of us who love democracy.
The Prime Minister made a case, something like this. He talked about dangers threatening our country, China, Iran, cyber attacks, gender activists included, and he claimed that only the Conservatives can keep us safe. I was struck by something he said about Labour. He said that Labour have just one thing, a calculation that can make you feel so bad about your country that you won't have the energy to ask what they might do with power. Does he genuinely believe, as that implies, that Keir Starmer wants people to feel bad about his country?
Well, I certainly know that as an opposition, what they spend a lot of their time doing is sitting on the sidelines and sniping. No actual solutions, and take defence as since you raise it as an example.
He raises these as great issues of moment, as you've just done.
Yes.
And then he says, Keir Starmer is just running down the country. Is that really the spirit in which we're going to do politics now?
Well, hold on. Let's look at the actual concerns that face the country when we've just been talking about them, these existential threats. Keir Starmer says, no, sure, look, don't worry, I want to get to 2.5% of GDP spent on defence. No, I can't tell you when I'll do it. In fact, I won't make that decision. In fact, I won't do it because we've said we'll do it by shrinking the size of the civil service back to where it was before COVID. Keir Starmer has ruled that out. Fair enough. But if he doesn't tell us how he's going to do it, how can he be serious about spending the money? Yeah,
this is the different thing. He may have a different view about how to do it, and he may not
actually going to do it, and that's dangerous.
But what the Prime Minister seems to be saying, let me put it as crudely as this, that Keir Starmer, in some senses, his patriotism should be questioned.
No, I think what was actually being saying is he runs down the country, snipes from the sidelines, and then when actually push comes to shove, he has dozens of members of his party, MPs, who voted against Trident. He himself tried to get Keir Starmer elected, who wanted to leave NATO. So I think actually the Prime Minister is quite right to raise concerns that actually easy to snipe from the sidelines, actually to do anything about it, or to be consistent in wanting to defend this country is a very different thing.
There are also internal threats, I think, that Prime Minister alluded to. We'll hear more from Lord Walney about that this week. Do you agree that there may be a case for prescription of more organisations which support or encourage extremism than is currently the case?
Look, we constantly keep this under review, and so there's almost certainly the answer in the end is yes. We don't do that lightly, and we need to always preserve, the freedom that we're trying to make sure that this country enjoys. So there's always that balance of free speech to be made. But do I think that there are organisations who are fundamentally trying to undermine our way of life? Yes, for certain. And of course, we need to watch those and decide when to prescribe them.
My colleagues here have been talking to Jim Ratcliffe, the boss of Ineos and also now part owner of Manchester United. He has a beef with you. 75% tax on oil and gas, he says, hurts his energy business, driving others away from the UK. But the important thing is that Ratcliffe is getting ready, it seems, for a Labour government. Does it disappoint you that the business leaders are now flocking to Labour events and basically writing you guys off?
Well, look, first of all, I read what he said, but I actually think he's wrong. And for example, one of his complaints was on immigration, not recognising that a large amount of the immigration last year came from, for example, Ukrainians coming here. And I had a family live with me. They were very welcome in this country. Same with British nationals from Hong Kong. So I thought there were very good reasons why, you know, this country being generous has done those sort of things. Secondly, I saw him refer to growth in the economy, and I just noticed our first quarter figures at 0.6% was faster than America, France, Germany, Japan. So I actually just thought that his analysis was wrong. Now he's a businessman, as you say, part owner of United. He will have his own agenda going on, but I just fundamentally disagreed with what he said.
All right. Maybe one way of bringing these people back into the Conservative fold would be maybe if you lose a general election, Conservatives might want to turn to an experienced cabinet minister to steady the ship. Let me ask you two things, really. If called, would you be ready to serve your party as leader? And by the way, what is the truth about schnapps with Shapps?
Well, first of all, I see what you're getting at here, but I actually am somebody who believes that the result of the next election is not over until we've fought that election. And by the way, 2015, Conservatives were never going to have a majority. I remember talking to you about it at the time. We did. 2016, we were going to stay in the EU, according to the pollsters. We left. 2017, with a very large lead in the polls. Theresa May, about the same size as the lead that Labour have now, by the way, lost that majority at the election, and that was in 6 weeks. So I do not think that the result of the next election is out of the way. And no, I've never had schnapps. Actually, I've never even tried schnapps in my life.
Oh, really? So all the stories we hear about the generosity, your generosity to your colleagues are just wrong. I'm disappointed.
Well, I certainly am. I hope to be generous to my colleagues, but there's a huge interest in defence in the Conservative Party and in the country, and I certainly try to keep them posted with what we're doing in defence policy, including winning that record additional £75 billion of investment into defence by getting to 2.5% of GDP.
Grant Shapps, thank you very much for your time this morning.
Thank you.
Let's see what our panel made of all that. We're joined all morning by the former Director General and FA Chair Greg Dyke, the Sunday Times political editor Caroline Wheeler, and former editor of The Sun, David Yelland. Caroline, if I may start with you on this infected blood question, which, how long have you been pursuing it?
It's really terrible. I was looking back at it this morning, and it's actually 25 years since I wrote my first story on the contaminated blood scandal. It was actually the first ever article that I ever wrote for any newspaper. I was a rookie reporter in the West Midlands working for a title called the Sunday Mercury, which was a sort of regional equivalent of the News of the World at the time, and was quite salacious. And I'd been deployed and deputed to be the person that picked up the phone calls in the office, which was always given to the sort of most junior member of the team to sort of assess whether there was a news story or not from people, from the general public calling in. And a chap called Mick Mason called me and told me the most extraordinary story about how he had been infected with hepatitis C and HIV and had recently received a letter telling him that he may also have been infected with variant CJD, which at the time was known as mad cow's disease. And he was considering going on a treatment strike because he felt that the product that he was still using at this stage, and this was back in 2001, was still not as safe as it could have been. So that gives you a kind of idea of just how long this has been going on. And at the time, I remember thinking he was a bit of a conspiracy theorist, and we didn't have the same kind of tools at our disposal then, like the internet, to check all of these things. And so I had to go back through the archives of this particular scandal and look about what had been written previously. And every word of it turned out to be true. And Mick Mason will be coming to London tomorrow. I'm going to be actually meeting him face to face for the first time after 25 years. We've been in touch all of that time, and he'll be in London to hear the results of the inquiry.
That's a phenomenal journalistic feat. I mean, all of us who are hacks would full of admiration for it. You must feel some vindication for what's going to come out tomorrow.
I actually feel quite sick. I've got a kind of terrible anxiety in my stomach because it feels like we've been up this mountain so many times and had these kind of, you know, incredible moments where it feels like you're on the cusp of something finally being sorted out, and then it hasn't happened for whatever reason. We've had apologies in the past. There was the Penrose inquiry in Scotland, which made only one recommendation after 7 years, and, you know, millions of pounds spent on it, which was that people should be tested for hepatitis C, and that report was branded a whitewash. I don't think that that's going to happen in this particular case, because Sir Brian has done one of the things I never thought was possible. He seems to have gained the trust of this particular group of individuals who don't trust the establishment very easily, as you can imagine. And he seems to have been taking what they've said very seriously. As your reporter said there, they have been conducting the Maxwellisation process for now years. Because
the Maxwellisation process that people have to see what's being said about them.
So we expect there to be some really serious criticism.
What did you make of what Grant Shapps had to say? Did that give you hope that this is going to reach an end, this saga?
What gives me hope is that we are talking about this now. This has been a scandal which the government has not wanted to talk about. It's been a scandal which we've had to drag, particularly, and I must pay tribute to Dame Diana Johnson, the Labour MP for Hull North, who has pursued this doggedly. But it has been kind of trying to force ministers to come to the chamber to talk about this. And now, at the top of your programme, we have a cabinet minister talking about it. My understanding is we will see the Prime Minister talk about it around tea time tomorrow, when he will give that official apology. So it's wonderful to see that it's now being given such a mainstream platform.
David, this is the sort of thing that you would have been on as an editor of a Red Top.
I think yes is the answer to that. I think what we're going to see tomorrow is everybody agreeing. We can already see today, Jeremy Hunt and Keir Starmer both talking about their own constituents, and there will be this compensation announced tomorrow, and the entire establishment, everybody, every political leader, every newspaper editor, everyone's going to be pointing in the same direction. The problem is, as Caroline's just said, that it's taken far too long for everybody to do that. And we do tend to do this as a country. We did it around the post office. We did it around the ICSA report, around Hillsborough, around many other things. We get to the end of a process when it's too late, and we all agree with each other.
Greg?
Well, I think that's fine. That's exactly what happens. I mean, Bloody Sunday was another one.
Absolutely.
You remember David Cameron standing up in the House of Commons and apologising for something he said that happened almost when he was a boy.
Yes.
And somehow we've got to work out how... And it's a failure of all of us, isn't it? It's a failure of journalism, it's a failure of the political system, and it's a failure. But how do we make this thing more effective? How do we make these speed up the process when these terrible things happen?
Well, let's see what Sir Brian says tomorrow, and probably will build on the kind of recommendations that James Jones made after Hillsborough inquiry and so on. We're seeing a lot of this now. Let's turn to the other set of questions that Grant Shapps and I talked about. Ukraine. I got a hint. I felt a hint, Caroline, that he wants something to happen in relation to giving the Ukrainians more ability to be offensive. What do you think is going on there?
Well, I think there is, within government a real sort of acknowledgement that this is, the fight of our lives, in that, if we don't sort of combat Putin at this stage, it will only lead to further and greater expansionist plans, and obviously will fuel China's ambitions with relation to Taiwan. And so they are very nervous about that being allowed to happen. And also, I mean, you can see, all the terrible news that's coming out at the moment suggests that the Russians are now pushing those boundaries yet further in the Kharkiv region, and that will obviously be something that sparks great anger and anxiety within the government because of this. And we know that there has been a kind of lack of munitions getting to the front line. I was in Kyiv a year ago and was speaking to people coming back from the front line, and they were very pointedly saying to me that the machinery and the armoury was not getting there fast enough, and that they were really struggling to kind of make advances there. So I think he does want to see more money going to the front line. I think one of the things that we can expect quite soon, but we still haven't seen huge developments in, is using the frozen Russian assets and the money that comes from that, certainly the interest, which needs to be
London.
Exactly, which needs to be a sort of G7 push. And I know that that's something that Grant Shapps and David Cameron have been pushing for, but yet hasn't happened. But will obviously then unleash another huge tranche of money, which is so vitally needed at the moment.
The Ukrainians are sounding pretty resentful at the moment. I mean, Zelensky essentially says we're in a stalemate and you're not really... you're afraid, actually, that Russia might lose, and essentially pointing to the West and saying, you're making this take harder than it needs to be.
Well, the question you didn't ask is what happens if Trump gets re-elected? Because that's a totally different game, I suspect. I mean, the danger is we'll be sitting here in 5 years' time having a similar discussion, that we're never going to invade or to support an invasion of Russia, and we'll financially support the Ukrainians so that they can continue the sort of fight that's going on. And in the end, but I mean, I presume if Trump gets elected, the American support will disappear, possibly. And in which case, there's then got to be some sort of solution. There's then got to be some sort of... And the Russians will effectively, Putin will effectively win.
I thought it was very interesting that Grant Shapps thanked the British people, although that's a bit of politicking ahead of the election. Actually, I was in Washington 2 weeks ago, and there is no feeling in the US about Ukraine, no mass support. It's not even in the media on a day-to-day basis, partly because, frankly, there's no public service broadcasting there. And then there's the other issue, which actually didn't come up in the interview at all, which is Israel and Gaza, which is absolutely where the focus is in DC at the moment, and most of the world, which has been an issue for Zelensky. And I thought that this is about British politics, really. It's not about Ukraine. It's about this. What Grant Shapps said about Ukraine is really about British politics. It's about trying to put Labour in the camp of they're not going to do what we're doing, which, of course, is probably not true anyway.
All right, we'll return to talk about domestic politics a little later. It's just after 9 o'clock. You're watching Sunday Morning with Trevor Phillips. The Defence Secretary's told this programme he agrees that the contaminated blood scandal is one of the country's most shameful episodes. Grant Shapps said the war in Ukraine is a battle for the West's way of life, and he thought Ukraine could repel Russia's attack on Kharkiv. Well, lots more to come this morning. Shortly, we'll hear from Labour's Shadow Health Secretary, Wes Streeting. Plus, after the attempted assassination of Slovakia's Prime Minister, we'll speak to the UK government's independent advisor on political violence, Lord Walney. And why Brexit hasn't been delivered, according to one of the country's richest businessmen. INEOS founder Sir Jim Ratcliffe tells us he understands why people want a change of government and hints the windfall tax is killing off oil and gas companies. Let's turn to Labour now. A little earlier, I spoke to Shadow Health Secretary Wes Streeting. Wes Streeting, the Archbishop of Canterbury has called on all parties to drop the 2-child limit on tax credits. I don't want to ask you about the policy, but speaking as a practising Anglican, is this really his business? Shouldn't he be focusing on getting people into church this morning rather than writing welfare policy?
No, I actually really welcome the Archbishop of Canterbury's intervention. You're never going to find, if there's a Labour government, politicians being sent out to attack the Archbishop of Canterbury for virtue signalling, as Conservative MPs have done. It's literally his job. He's the one person in the country whose job it is to signal virtue. And if the mission of the church is not to alleviate poverty and suffering, then I don't know what is. If you read the Bible, if you believe in the Bible, that central driving mission of Christianity, I think, is a rage against injustice, and that's what the Archbishop of Canterbury is doing. I take him really seriously, and if we are fortunate enough to be in government after the next general election, we will have a serious cross-government strategy for not just reducing child poverty, but ending child poverty, because that's the driving mission of Labour too. So
he's going to get a yes back from you. The cap has gone now. if Labour is in government?
Well, look, one of the consequences of the Conservatives' disastrous handling of the economy is the public finances are in the mess and there are harder choices to make. So unless and until I can sit on your programme and say we will do X by funding it through Y, that's not a commitment I'm able to make today. And all I'd say is on this issue, because I think social security is part of alleviating poverty, and I know that the benefit system put food in the fridge and money in the electric meter when I was growing up. But if you're serious about ending child poverty, you need a strategy that attacks the causes. So, for example, building 1.5 million new homes would make a real difference to reducing housing costs and providing security.
I want to come to wider issues, but just on this particular one, you're sounding like somebody who actually agrees with the Archbishop, and if you can do it, you would like to get rid of this limit.
Well, I voted against the two-child limit, so by definition, I wish it wasn't there. But as we've seen across the board, it's a lot easier to get rid of stuff than it is to put stuff back, and that's the frustrating thing about the vandalism we've seen through 14 years of Conservative government.
All right. Let's talk about something which has spanned many administrations of both colours, all three colours, in fact, and that is the infected blood scandal. If the government agrees to a compensation scheme as set out by Sir Brian Langstaff, will Labour fall in behind that?
Absolutely. We've been calling on the government to act. The Labour Party has. We've got brilliant campaigners like Diana Johnson, who has really fought for these families. And I haven't seen the report yet, but I would anticipate that Sir Brian Langstaff's going to criticise, as you said, successive governments. Everyone has got their responsibility to bear in this appalling scandal, and we've got a shared responsibility to put it right. And I was really pleased to see the front page of the Sunday Times today, who've been, Caroline Wheeler and others also campaigning brilliantly on this. Because every 4 days, one of the victims dies without justice. So the moment to act can't come soon enough.
So the answer here is whatever it takes, you will pay?
Well, we'll back the Chancellor. I'm sure he's going to make the right decision this week, and he'll have our support in doing it. And if that's the only thing he does between now and the election, that's the right thing to do, the right priority, and we'll have rare cross-party consensus in a general election year.
All right, let's see if we can upset the consensus a little bit. Sir Jim Ratcliffe says he expects Labour to win an election, criticised the government's 75% tax on oil and gas. Now, he's been talking to Rob Harris, my colleague here. He met Keir Starmer last Sunday at Old Trafford. Is Labour going to change its line on the windfall tax on big energy?
No, it's an important part of capitalising GB Energy, which is going to be our publicly owned energy company, which is going to work with the private sector to unlock private sector investment in the renewable energy that our country needs, but also ensure that as the taxpayers investing with the private sector, we get a return on that investment. We're putting a stake in and we will get a return. So it means alongside lower bills, more jobs, giving Britain its energy security back, we will also see a taxpayer return on the investment, which is the right way to do government.
Ratcliffe is one of Britain's biggest, wealthiest and most influential business people, and it's been reported that quite a lot of people are coming across from that community to Labour, and you're very pleased about all of that. Now, in this interview, he also expresses some forthright views on immigration, pointing out that he supported Brexit because, as he put it, we cannot cope with the vast numbers of people coming into the United Kingdom who overburden the NHS. Are you sure that's the message that you want projected?
Well, I think we do need to reduce net migration, as well as deal with some of the challenges we've got in relation to challenges like small boats.
But he's saying migration is overwhelming the... overburdening, I beg your pardon, the NHS. That's your...
Well, look, I think you have to look at this in the round as well, because, I'm conscious of the fact that we are actually over-reliant on migration to staff the NHS at the moment. So we are taking people from red list countries, countries that by definition have a severe shortage of their own healthcare workers. And the reason we've been recruiting so many people from overseas to work in the NHS is because we haven't been investing in our own homegrown talent. We've actually been turning away thousands of straight-A students from studying medicine at university because of the cap on places. And actually, I think not only is that immoral as far as recruitment from red list countries goes, I think it's unfair to UK students who've been turned away, and I think it's a long-term strategic risk to the NHS because there's a global shortage of healthcare workers now. So we have to be self-sufficient in terms of building, training, drawing on our own homegrown talent. But look, you know, Trevor, the last 75 years, the story of the NHS has run alongside the story of Empire Windrush.
Yeah, but
and migration's built the NHS as well as...
Before we go into history, what Ratcliffe is basically saying is that there's too much pressure, there's too much demand on the NHS, and one way of reducing that demand is by reducing immigration.
Well, no, I think that there are a whole range of reasons why the NHS is under enormous pressure, not least the catastrophic decisions we've seen throughout the last 14 years of Conservative government.
All right.
But this is why I think the picture's a bit more complicated than Sir Jim set out, because, you know, migration has also been a huge part of staffing the NHS. And similarly, I see the government is now waging war on international students. Well, what a way to shoot yourself in the foot when it comes to the future of the economy.
Forgive me if I interrupt you. Our time is limited, and every time we get back into how awful the government is in its 14 years, I want to start talking about what Labour wants to do. And actually, your leader has spelt out some of that, and you know, you and I have had this conversation before, and you always say, "Why are you complaining that we don't have policy?" Now you've got policy. He spelt out these 6, let's call them baby steps.
First steps.
Now viewers can see them, what they are. The first thing that is, I think, most striking about this is that there are no actual numbers. Oh, well, there's one actual number here: 6,500 teachers. And that doesn't even have sell-by date. Is this really accountability? Because you could be sitting here in 5 years' time, and I'll say to you, none of this has been done, and you'll say to me, well, we didn't put a date on it, did we?
Well, cut NHS waiting times is by delivering 40,000 more appointments every week at extra evening and weekend clinics. The crackdown on antisocial... Well, I think we can get those appointments up and running within the first year of a Labour government, by the way. So that we can get on with that quite quickly. Cracking down on antisocial behaviour, that's by training 13,000 new police officers. The Border Security Command, Great British Energy, these are specific outputs. And look, I take the point on economic stability that people might say, but stability, well, unfortunately, stability is change compared to where we are with this government.
This is interesting. Can you get this done can you get all of this done within the first year?
I certainly think, you know, working through economic stability, yes, we're going to respect institutions, have a serious industrial strategy and plan for growth. 40,000 more appointments in the first year, certainly. Border Security Command should be able to get up and running very quickly. Great British Energy will take some time to deliver, but I think we can do that fairly quickly as well.
I thought it was very interesting, because actually... I'm criticising them for being vague. You're being really rather specific here, because I want to compare this to the, if you like, the precursor, the 1997 pledge card. If you look at this, what's interesting about this is this one's got numbers all the way through it. It's very specific about what they're going to deliver and by when. The issue that I'm really asking here is, the way you've put this out gives you a lot of wriggle room, doesn't it?
No, I don't think... If you actually look at...
And you're going to be turning up here in this studio saying, oh, no, I didn't promise you by then.
No, if you look at the card that was published this week, those numbers are on the back there. You've taken the headlines. But one of the great things I love about looking back at the 97 pledges, we said we would cut NHS waiting lists by 100,000 by sacking some NHS managers. Now, what we've got now is more ambitious than that, but also, look back at 97, we delivered the shortest waiting times and the highest patient satisfaction in history. It may not have been on the pledge card in 97 because we were doing the same thing then that we're doing now, which is setting out first steps, giving a cynical public some specific things they can judge us on. We're going to under-promise and over-deliver. That's what we did in 1997. That's what we'll do in 2024. What a contrast to 14 years of over-promising and under-delivering.
Let me just ask you something about the... let's just talk about the politics at the moment. I know you aren't complacent about the 20% polling lead. You've said that to me several times. But let me show you something that might give some of your more bullish colleagues pause for thought. I'm going to read this. It says, a quote from a leading politician, I was probably 20 points ahead. in most of the election campaign for 2017. And look what happened to that. Against a background of the economy improving, I think it's not a foregone conclusion. This is Theresa May, who does know what she's talking about when it comes to losing big leads. Does this make you feel a bit queasy about that 20-point lead?
She's absolutely right. And if people want change, they have to vote for it. Not a single vote has been cast in this general election. There is everything still for us to work for. We don't take people for granted. We will never take people for granted. We're working hard for every single vote. And the fact the Prime Minister was talking about hung Parliament tells you that he is determined to cling on by his fingernails. So if people want to turn the page on this absolute clown show of a government, the way to do that is to vote Labour at the general election, and that general election can't come soon enough.
Wes Streeting, thank you very much for your time this morning.
You.
Back to our panel, Greg Dyke, Caroline Wheeler and David Yelland. Greg, should the Archbishop of Canterbury be writing welfare policy?
He should be saying what he believes. I mean, I'm not a religious man at all, but I welcome what he says because I think it's important for, in his role, to say those things. I mean, I never understood why they introduced the policy in the first place, the two-child policy. I mean, it seemed to be almost saying, you shouldn't have more children if you can't afford it, and therefore we're going to penalise them. And I think it was always a misguided policy, and I'm glad he said what he said.
David, what do you think the impact of this intervention will be?
I think it will annoy all the people that he wanted to annoy, which is the whole point of doing it. I once went to see actually Justice Welby with another former tabloid editor who will remain nameless, and the other chap said, "What do you do about these social problems?" And Justin Welby said, "Well, I tend to pray about them." And he said, "Well, what good does that do?" And at which point the Archbishop said, "If praying doesn't work, I'm in the wrong job." So I think he's a very good man.
Okay, Caroline, this is. I mean, it is an interesting thing, the question of whether these interventions have any influence at all or not. Wes Streeting seemed to line up directly with the Archbishop. Do you think? But he wasn't quite clear about whether Labour would, in fact, reverse this policy.
They've been quite clear that they're not going to make any commitments on it with this side of a general election. I mean, I actually think the intervention that was probably more difficult for them to sort of stomach was the intervention that Gordon Brown made when he basically said that this policy was responsible for plunging more families into poverty and made the argument that there were many reasons why, if you changed it, actually, you could lift, up to 800,000 families off the breadline. So I think that is much more uncomfortable for them to see and hear people from within their own party making the argument. And clearly, although he didn't say it, and he very sort of adeptly sidestepped the question, it is something that he voted against. I think Wes Streeting, given his own background and his own experiences from childhood, will be privately very supportive of the idea of getting rid of this as soon as the finances allow. And I would imagine that this is something that would be, top of their priority if and when that happens. But they don't want to make any commitments to anything that costs money this side of an election.
Well, we've seen what their commitments are in these six pledges. David, how do you think these are going to influence the election? Is it worth doing this kind of thing?
Well, there's a very important word in that document, and it's the word steps. Right? These are steps towards things, and I think that's very smart. I think they're going to win the election, I will predict. Okay, so the job in hand is not to lose the election, and those 6 steps actually, I think they're clearly. There are many things that many people would want to see in there, but they are things I think they can say hand on heart they will deliver on, and the public will buy that, and therefore it will work.
Greg?
I don't think they'll make any difference at all. I think they're a good thing to do, but I don't think they'll make any difference. I agree with you. I think it's like the phony war, isn't it, at the moment?
Yeah.
We're living through a period when the government has lost, and they know they've lost, and they know they're going to lose, and we're just waiting for the next lot.
Does none of you credit Theresa May's caution about foreshadowing the result? I mean, everybody did think that she was going to walk it in 2017, and exactly the reverse happened.
I think listening to Wes Streeting, let's just take child poverty as one issue, and there've been, Carolyn's just talked very powerfully about that. There are so many structural problems that have gone wrong in this country that people are just going to blame the government, and many of them are the government's fault. Some of them aren't the government's fault, but it's not like Theresa May. We're not in that situation. And sometimes when I'm talking to Tories privately, I say to them, do you really think you should remain in power forever? I mean, and newspaper editors as well, without naming any names. I mean, we do live in a system where the other side wins occasionally. We do. That is the way of democracy.
Do you think it's sealed, Caroline?
Well, I think that, actually it is something, the Theresa May factor, that Labour do think about. I mean, it was absolutely astonishing, and having been a political editor at the time and seeing, us writing front pages saying that Theresa May was going to win a majority bigger than Thatcher's, and to see that then crumble away and see her being propped up by the DUP is a cautionary tale for anybody. I mean, I actually think what's quite interesting about Labour's strategy is they seem to be adopting this sort of Ming vase strategy, which is to sort of try and not rock the boat too much on anything. But I do worry sometimes.
This is a famous Roy Jenkins story about carrying a Ming vase across a polished floor and trying desperately not to slip up and drop it.
Yeah, and there's been a few wobbly moments recently. It was only a week or so ago that we saw those defections, which caused that kind of, extreme sort of backlash within the Labour Party. And, one of the things that has been sort of notable by the pledge cards was obviously the omission of the tax pledge that Tony Blair had made not to put up taxes. And that's something that could cause Labour some issues if there's any fear that they could be the big tax party, which is always the kind of, the danger.
But isn't this just a discussion amongst the political classes, really? That actually the public haven't read those six pledges and they don't care. I mean, I've always believed, they vote, the public votes against governments, basically. And they're going to vote against this government, and they're going to vote against this government for a series of reasons that we could all name.
OK. Coming up, I'll speak to the government's independent advisor on political violence and disruption, Lord Walney.
I'm Greg Milam, and I'm Sky's Chief North of England correspondent. We aim to be the best and most trusted place for news.
A review of political violence and disruption is reportedly going to recommend that teachers be given legal protection against blasphemy claims by religious groups. The Times says that the report by the government advisor Lord Walney will call for statutory guidance to protect teachers' freedom of expression. Lord Walney is with me now. Before we get on to the specifics of your report and what you've been asked to do, the government apparently is saying that they'll be looking again at the policing of protests, particularly worrying about the cumulative impact of pro-Palestine marches. Do you think that there is a case for giving police powers to stop these regular marches?
Well, my precise recommendations will be in the review, which I'm hoping will be published this week. But I've been concerned over many months now that the police do seem limited in what they are able to do to be able to balance people's right to protest with the cumulative impact of having marches through central London on a weekly or very regular basis, which is making substantial parts of the community, the majority or sizable parts of our Jewish community in London, apprehensive at best about going into the centre of the city, and that is a deeply uncomfortable position. Now, the police are in a difficult position to balance this. Government is. This is not easy, but I think you look at the public order framework that we have. It's been revised in recent years, and it is being really substantially tested by this phenomenon of the weekly pro-Gaza marches.
And is the issue here not the behaviour on any given particular march, but the fact that they occur so regularly? Is that the point here?
Well, I think you've had both. Now, the march organisers and many people who are attending the marches say, well, we are being peaceful, but there has been a substantial level of criminality and disorder and anti-Semitic content around the margins of the marches. That is a concern in of itself. But yes, that I think there has been a concern that the public order framework at the moment, the police have to make a judgment on the day whether there is a threat of serious disorder on a particular march. And there is a more limited ability to look across the piece at the cumulative impact to a community or to businesses of having this regular drumbeat.
OK. Can you just explain to us, what was the brief for the report that you were given that you hope will come out this week?
I was asked to look across the piece at the domestic extremism at the far right, but also at the anti-democratic far left, and to look at whether there has been sufficient attention to the way in which far-left organisations can seek to disrupt and undermine our country. And I hope that my review, when it's published, will be a contribution towards a rebalancing, looking, yes, of course, at the focus we have on violent Islamism and the more violent threat from far-right groups is really important, but that there is also a perhaps underappreciated element of the extreme far left seeking to undermine institutions and the basic democratic principles that have underpinned our country for many years.
Can you give us an example? Because I suppose a lot of people would say, honestly, this isn't a big deal. This is a bunch of, slightly irrelevant small groups of people. Is this really a serious problem?
I think it is. I think we are seeing a democracy at the moment which feels under strain and under threat. We have got lawmakers who are facing violent threats and intimidation on a daily basis.
You've heard this from MPs?
Well, absolutely. I mean, you talk to MPs and you look at some of the available figures at the way that the levels of public protection funding have been soaring in recent months. So you have a level of threat and intimidation that is being placed on MPs principally through the Gaza, through the extreme elements of pro-Palestinian protesters. You're having council meetings disrupted, and this is, many people talk about this as an extension of our democracy, rather than, I think, what it is, actually unacceptable attempts to coerce and intimidate lawmakers and the public. So I hope that we will be able to restart the conversation about how we protect our liberal democracy and the rule of law.
Prescribing some of those organisations?
Well, let's wait for the conclusions of my review. But I think there is, when you look at organisations who use criminal tactics as a means, a very deliberate means to try to force the conversation towards the kind of change that they want, rather than engaging in our democratic channels, I think it does ask questions.
Palestine action?
Both of those organisations are clearly breaking the law as a way of trying to force the conversation, and I think we should be less relaxed about that. The level of deterrent...
To the point of banning them, perhaps?
Well, let's see.
As an option?
Well, I think... We'll wait for my review hopefully this week. But I think when you look at how prescription has worked in the terrorist context, now these organisations have not yet been judged to meet the terrorist threshold, which is clearly defined and the Home Secretary has to rule on. But there is that space where if organisations are clearly using criminal tactics, they are not being deterred by the individual offences that activists are being charged with. But prescription has worked in the terrorist context to be able to restrict the activities of certain organisations. Okay. It's not perfect, but it can be an important tool.
One area in which I think there has been great sensitivity is conflict, and YouGov's survey published last autumn suggested that 1 in 5 teachers censors himself or herself for fear of causing offence.
Yeah.
Do you believe that?
I can well believe that is true, because I think there is just a level of uncertainty from the teaching establishment, from other professions, about where the acceptable boundaries of freedom of expression, particularly in terms of religion, particularly often in terms of religions that they may not be as familiar with themselves. And let's remember the context of this. We have got a teacher from Batley, from West Yorkshire, who is still in hiding 3 years after the controversy over his showing of classmates of an image of the Prophet Muhammad. That is totally unacceptable, and I think that it does call into question how we can guide the teaching establishment and other professions through these difficult issues more effectively.
Lord Walney, thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing your report this week.
Thanks, Trevor.
Okay. In just a moment, we'll hear Brexit-supporting businessman Jim Ratcliffe. Jim Ratcliffe is one of the biggest names in British business. His huge chemicals company, INEOS, is one of the country's biggest firms. He's also now a huge name in sport, owning a big stake in Manchester United and sponsoring teams in cycling and sailing. And he's known as a big supporter of Brexit and the Conservatives. But in an exclusive interview for Sky News, he sounds pretty unimpressed with both, saying he gets why the country feels ready for a change of government. He was speaking to Sky's Rob Harris.
You were saying a few months ago that you think this current government has been sort of damaging for business. You were with Sir Keir Starmer last weekend. Do you have more optimism that for INEOS, the Labour government would be better?
I'm sure Keir will do a very good job of running the country. I've no questions about that. I think the UK does need to get a bit sharper on the business front, and I think the government needs, I think the biggest objective for the government is to create growth in the economy. And, there's two parts of the economy. There's the services side of the economy and there's the manufacturing side. And the manufacturing, unfortunately, has been sliding away now for the last 25 years. We were very similar in scale to Germany probably 25 years ago, but today we're just a fraction of where Germany is. And I think that isn't healthy for the British economy because, and particularly when you think the north of England is very manufacturing based. And, that talks to things like energy competitiveness. It talks to things like, why do you put an immensely high tax on the North Sea when what you want, that just disincentivises people from finding hydrocarbons in the North Sea and energy. And what we need competitive energy. So, why in America, in the energy world, in the oil and gas world, they just apply corporation tax to the oil and gas companies, which is about 30%. And in the UK, we've got this tax of 75% because we want to kill off the oil and gas companies. But if we don't have competitive energy, we're not going to have a healthy manufacturing industry. And that just makes no sense to me at all. None.
So, you are representing Britain in part with this America's Cup Challenge. You're using Britannia. So, what do you think would be best for the country in this election year in terms of?
Oh, I think. In my view, there's no question that the Conservatives have had they've had a good run. Over the last, probably 15, 20 years, and I think most of the country probably feels it's time for a change, and I sort of get that, really.
Are you going to fund some of that change? Invest in Labour?
I've got lots to do. No, we're apolitical at INEOS, We just want a successful manufacturing sector in the UK. We'll talk to either government about that.
Has Brexit impacted that?
We're quite clear about our views.
Has Brexit impacted that?
Well, Brexit sort of unfortunately didn't turn out as people anticipated because we didn't really, Brexit was, largely about immigration. That was the biggest component of that vote. People were getting fed up with the influx of, the city of Southampton coming in every year. I think last year it was 2 times Southampton. A small island like the UK can't cope with vast numbers of people coming into the UK. It just overburdens the National Health Service, the traffic service, the police, everybody. They can't. The country was designed for 55 or 60 million people, and we've got 70 million people, and all the services break down as a consequence. So that's what Brexit was all about, and nobody's implemented that. They just keep talking about it, but nothing's been done, which is why I think we'll finish up with a change of government, to be honest.
In just a moment, we'll be back with our panel.
It's highly fatal. It's a synthetic opioid, as you mentioned. It's like heroin and morphine. And last year we've been talking about fentanyl. They add it to the heroin and give it to people, and people die immediately because of the power of fentanyl as synthetic opioid also. Nitazene is much more powerful, more fatal, and we have some fatalities this year everywhere in the UK. And because we have patients who are on addiction treatment and they take heroin, so we inform them, please don't take any heroin now without knowing what they are giving you. And the problem is the decline in heroin trade made drug dealers contaminate heroin with these things to sell because there's no heroin coming from Afghanistan. So nitazene is very dangerous. They can contaminate heroin with it. They can give you a tablet, say this is ecstasy or MDMA. They can give you a tablet which is diazepam, and it is nitazene, and people dying.
He and his friends have made a plan to go to Leeds Festival for the summer of August 2022. I dropped David off on a Thursday at the festival, and over the weekend, as we learned afterwards and subsequently, a number of things happened to David and his friends that ultimately led to the point where David took MDMA, what he thought was MDMA, on the Saturday night. And unfortunately, whatever David took or however much David took, it proved fatal. And the next day, he died. I think for parents, first of all, we're the first line of defence. And together with our friends, we really need to equip young people to be ready for the festival experience and what will happen to them. So remember, David was 16, and there are lots of 16 and 17-year-olds attend festivals like Leeds and Reading because it falls at the time that they get their GCSE results. They are unable to buy alcohol. Alcohol purchasing is really strictly enforced on festival sites. And so they're easy prey for drug dealers who see an opportunity to sell them drugs. And in David's case, it was exactly that. They'd run out of alcohol on the Saturday, and they were offered something free initially, and then something else happened where they purchased some drugs. But ultimately, they were groomed to the point where they decided to take a step that ultimately proved fatal for David.
Back to our panel, Greg Dyke, Caroline Wheeler and David Yelland. David, he said, time for a change, really, Jim Ratcliffe. Is he speaking for England, do you think?
I think he's going with the flow. You know, I think just going with it. Like a lot of people in business, they can see the way it's going, you know. I did think, as a supporter of Manchester City, as I am, that to sort of suggest that the taxpayer pays for a new Old Trafford was a bit much. We'll probably talk about that in a minute.
Well, maybe we should talk about it now, since we have the Manchester United representative sitting at the other end of the table. Greg, does the taxpayer need to stump up for a stupendously wealthy American-backed corporation?
I think I'll pass on that one. I don't think I can give you... No, but although sometimes someone should have a real look at the finances of Manchester City and how much that was funded by the local authority.
Well, I mean, I think the answer to that is that the City of Manchester Stadium, of course, was built for the Commonwealth Games.
Yes.
And became the Etihad. And if you look in East Manchester, there's been tremendous redevelopment there, absolutely superb redevelopment. I think there probably does need to be a Wembley Stadium type thing in the north of England, but I don't know whether it should be in Manchester, actually. I mean, I'm not sure.
Since I think you're a Blackburn Rovers supporter.
My children are Blackburn Rovers supporters.
But I have a feeling that Blackburn Rovers got all this money from just a very rich person and not from the taxpayer. Do you think football is basically looming too large in our world? I mean, here it is, getting into what is a serious political programme.
I think my children would kill me if I said that it did. My son, who's 14, Luke, is an absolutely massive Rovers fan. Jack Walker is this complete hero. Yeah, I mean, there's always a role for anything in politics. I think we have to involve it in everything we do.
But without Jack Walker's money, of course, Blackburn have
Wouldn't
not done
exactly.
well.
No, that's very true.
All right. Let's go back to vulgar politics.
Yeah.
There is a sort of, as Ratcliffe seems to say, there's a sort of assumption that we're heading towards a Labour administration. The polls have been pretty steady for the last year and a half with a 20% lead. But and we've been talking all year on the show about this likely being a long campaign. This week, Labour officially launched theirs in all but name. The party still enjoys a massive lead in the polls. But we've been doing some digging through history, which suggests that Labour shouldn't be resting on their laurels. Let's have a look at the evidence. Back in 1957, Labour's lead over the governing Conservatives sat at 18.5%, smaller than Keir Starmer's average lead today. But at the election 2 years later, that had evaporated, turning into a Tory majority of 100. Then let's go to 1980, midway through Margaret Thatcher's first term. Here's a 24% Labour lead, and it vanished into a Conservative landslide. Labour had another 24% lead in 1990. 2 years later, famous shock result. I reported it, actually. John Major led the Tories to a 21-seat majority. Well,
you've missed out the Falklands War, of course, that happened in one of those.
I mean, it doesn't matter what the events were. In the end, it doesn't matter whether there was a foul on the pitch or not. Yeah. The question is, we got one more goal than you, right? The point is that Labour is famous for snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. Caroline, why not here?
Well, I think again, all of these are cautionary tales for the Labour Party, and I think, one of the things that you never takes account of really in the polls is the sort of the shy Tory phenomenon. And one of the things that we've looked at in our polling quite often is the number of don't knows. And actually, during the course of the past year, the numbers are coming down and people seem to be, sort of broadly speaking, making their mind up. But there's still a lot of uncertainty, I think, because there is just so much apathy around. People think that both parties are the same, they're not going to make any difference. We've had another period where sleaze has featured quite prominently in the news, and I think that there is a sense of a kind of plague on both your houses in many ways. So I think that's the thing to look out for when you're looking at the polling is how many people have absolutely made their minds up.
Except it's probably I agree. I mean, the figures do show the disillusionment with politics is enormous, but they're more disillusioned with the Tories than they are with Labour.
Yeah, I think that's right. But I think also what's kind of borne out by it, sometimes when you get the focus groups that go alongside it, is that people are absolutely fed up with the Tories, and they're interested in Labour, but they haven't been kind of, it's almost like they're looking in the shop window now, but they haven't necessarily decided to buy yet. And I think that some of that is around, what Sir Keir Starmer stands for. I mean, I was watching the Blair years again the other day, and I mean, it's quite an amazing thing to remember 97 when, there was real euphoria in the country and people turning up outside Downing Street and cheering and waving flags.
Well,
I don't see that.
To be fair, they've been shipped in by the Labour Party, if I remember.
Probably no more.
Let's not go too far into the weeds of ancient history, but there is a sort of enthusiasm gap. What do you think that, David, that the Tories could do to either pull something back, to avoid a humiliating defeat, or maybe engineer something that could essentially change the weather?
I think their only hope is events, something happening, something huge happening. But, I think we're missing something here, which is how difficult it is for the Labour Party to be elected in this country. It hasn't happened many times since 45. The entire institutions of the media, of so much else in this country, are wired to re-elect the Conservative Party. The Conservative Party are the natural party of government, so they think. And I think sometimes when I listen to cabinet ministers, I feel like saying to them, hang on a minute, you're not automatically getting to run this country, And I think that, so if you talk to senior Labour people, of course they know that they are going to win, but they're never going to... I think the way that they are marshalling their forces, understanding that between now and the election, there will be a lot of very powerful people trying to stop them.
I can't remember who it was that said this, but a very senior politician once said that Britain is a conservative country that occasionally elects a Labour government. There's a wider issue, I think, which is, you've touched on, Greg, which is, in a way, faith in politics itself. We're seeing something north of 100 MPs leaving. Now, that happens generally, but 60, 70 of them are Conservatives who clearly think that, you know, they may not come back. But we've seen this week, former Cabinet Minister Nadhim Zahawi decided he's not standing again. This morning, Chris Heaton-Harris, who's Cabinet Minister now, said he's not standing again. Are people losing faith in politics as a way of making things happen, do you think?
Yes, and not just here. This isn't just a British phenomenon. This is a European phenomenon. It's certainly an American phenomenon. I mean, what's happening in America is fascinating, really. So I do think people are questioning, does it make any difference? You know, the sort of things you've always heard, but does it make any difference who I vote for? Which is why they'll vote against this government, because they say, I've had enough of them, I'll try the other lot. If I was Labour, I mean, you remember when Blair got elected, you know, they were obsessed about winning a second time, absolutely obsessed about it. I wouldn't have great faith in if Labour wins this time and then winning a second time. I think that disillusionment with politics is deeply felt.
20 seconds, Caroline. Is a trade that you and I are in doomed?
Oh gosh, are we doomed? No, absolutely not. I think we were just talking about it actually before. I think, you know, there's never been a time when journalism is needed more than it is now to hold governments and ministers to account. OK, that's it for us this week. Watch Sophie every night this week. See you next Sunday.